morning since Russia invaded Ukraine. And if we just bring up the map here, this is the overall picture on the ground. You can see how Ukraine has been attacked from the north, the east and the south, and Russia has gained some territories. Now, overnight, there were air raid sirens in Kiev and also in Kharkiv, but the early indications from Kiev are that it has not been heavily struck overnight. The curfew that has been in place for more than 24 hours is now over. People can...
Okay, so this is my second video on this Russian-Ukrainian conflict, and in this video we're going to quickly discuss the Western agenda. We'll also go through some of the hypocritical statements from the media. You know, for the past 20 years when the Muslim nations were being attacked and killed by the Westerners, we understand the way propaganda works and the way Western media works. And so, like, if you wanted to see two sides of the story, it's very hard to find that. You won't find it on Fox, BBC, Sky News. Most of the media out there, you know, you always hear Ukraine, you always hear what the president of Ukraine says. They do everything in their power to translate it into English, and they give you a whole documentary. Just recently on the ABC, they had a documentary. This was published, I think, the first or the second day of the war, where they published it on Western media, showing how Vladimir Putin is a dictator. And so we're used to these games. I mean, that's what they did when they went and invaded Iraq, to win public opinion, to get everyone on their side. They constantly produced all of these documentaries, videos, trying to make Saddam Hussein look like a tyrant, a dictator. And so that's their game. We know what they do. They did the same with Gaddafi in Libya. They've done the same with... they're doing the same with President Erdogan. You know, they're producing documentaries, videos. They're constantly hurling him as a dictator, a tyrant. And this is their aim, to divide the people. And they continue to divide the people. If you notice, like, they'll always upload videos on their Western social media networks showing how Russians are protesting in the street, and how, you know, their freedom of expression is being impinged because they're being arrested by Russian police officers. And then they start showing how a Russian man is trying to turn away all these tanks, and people are saying, you know, like Westerners are saying, like, you know, we're not against Russia, we're just against Putin. You know, this isn't, you know, the Russian people are innocent from this. This is all about Putin. Putin is a dictator. You know, these Russian soldiers are being misled. It's none of their fault that this is happening. You know, if we capture a Russian soldier, please don't hurt him. You know, he's innocent. He's just listening to the orders of Putin. And this is all part of their propaganda. This is all part of their way to divide Russia, to say, look, Russia is with us. Russia is with us against Putin, right? And this is their whole propaganda. And this propaganda was in the Muslim world too. Oh yeah, we're not against the Afghani people. We're just against the Taliban. You know, we're not really against the people of Iraq. We're just against Saddam Hussein. He's the tyrant. You know, we don't really have a problem with Muslims. We just have a problem with Osama bin Laden. That's why we're going to kill him. So this is their way of trying to get Muslims on the same path to fight against terrorism. And what they're really fighting for, it wasn't really about Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden was killed many, many years ago, but America was still in Afghanistan enforcing their Western moral values into that country. It wasn't just about removing Osama bin Laden, it was about imposing Western imperialism, Western morals, Western ethics, forcing those moral values into a Muslim culture, forcing that Western ideals. And they were saying, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists, right? This was their whole propaganda, that if you were with Osama bin Laden, then that means you're with Sharia law. But if you're against us, then you're against democracy, you're against secularism, you're against liberalism, you're against our values, which means you're actually with the terrorists. But no, we're not with the terrorists, but we're not with the West too. But you see, they wanted to make it as if you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. There was no middle ground. Muslims could not say, no, we're neither with both of you. No, you either had to be with the West or they'd tarnish you as being a terrorist. So the same is now applying with President Putin. It's like you're either with the West, you're with democracy, you're with human rights, or you're with dictatorship and tyranny and invasion, despite the fact that the West has invaded the Muslim world, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. And any leader that they disagree with in the Muslim world, they impose sanctions, boycott him, like they did with President Erdogan. Because President Erdogan brought S-400s from Russia, America sent sanctions on Turkey for buying Russian weapons, despite America claiming that Turkey is their ally. If Israel brought S-400s from Russia, would America have put sanctions on Israel? Every single person is aware that it's just a power game. America, Great Britain, France, NATO, all those Western nations, they can't see Russia being a dominant superpower in the region. That's it. No, it is the West that want to be dominant. It is the Western, as in America, NATO, France, UK. They want to be dominant in the region. Who the hell is Russia? You know, these people make me laugh. Oh, we're in the 21st century. How can another country invade another country? How could Russia impose its government on Ukraine and want to make Ukraine one with Russia? How could that be, despite the fact that America and the West want to make the whole globe submit to Western moral values, that Western governments infiltrate all other governments and impose their secular liberalism in those countries. And if you aren't in line with American or Western liberal values, then you're an outcast. You are no longer an ally. You are an outcast, and you need to be killed, bombed, you need to be sanctioned, so your government comes in line with our national interests, with our beliefs. But if you start practicing Sharia, and if your government adopts Khilafah, and you want to oppose Western values, then we're going to come to that country, we're going to bomb you to the Stone Age, and we're going to replace your leaders to ones who are more democratic, like they supported, for example, Sisi in Egypt, where we had Mohamed Morsi. The Westerners were completely supporting Sisi to overthrow Mohammed Morsi, who was more conservative and Sunni, and they replaced him for who? They replaced him for Sisi, and they endorsed it. They never once put sanctions on Sisi. They never forced Sisi out of government. They never said, you forced yourself into government. You weren't democratically elected by the people. No, they completely turned a blind eye to it. There was no sanctions put on him, and Sisi took control. And why? Because Sisi is in support of Israel. That's why Sisi, when the Gaza-Israeli conflict happened, as Sisi, he blocked humanitarian aid coming into Gaza. He condemned any Muslims in Palestine for showing any aggression against Israel. And the hypocrisy, ladies and gentlemen, the hypocrisy, how they're constantly hurling sanctions, the whole NATO, the European nations, constant sanctions when a Christian nation like Russia decides to invade another Christian nation. Where were their sanctions when Syria were crying? Where were the sanctions where Russia started bombing Syria and joining hands with Bashar al-Assad, killing their own people? Where was US when they started invading Iraq? Fake weapons of mass destruction. The UN, the United Nations, proved through their weapons inspectors back in 2002, they proved that there was no weapons of mass destruction. And America said, no, we're going to go in anyway because we're going to take down Saddam Hussein. Why? A Sunni leadership. We're going to replace him for a more secular, liberal Shia leadership to disunite the Muslims, to create fractions which costed, so much war and the rise of ISIS and so forth. Where were the sanctions against America when they started invading these countries? Where was the international community? Why did they not impose the same sanctions like they're doing for Putin? Well, it's very simple. Saddam Hussein was a Muslim. His people were Muslims. America was killing Muslims. Therefore, there was no sanctions against the Bush administration. I could almost guarantee if Russia invaded somewhere like Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan or Chechnya or Turkmenistan, if he invaded these countries, all Vladimir Putin would have said was, I'm invading these terrorists. The whole world would have been sympathetic with Vladimir Putin. None of them would have said, we're going to put sanctions on you and we're going to stop you and we're going to boycott you and we're going to, give you, our might and we're going to show you unity, that we're all against this, against you. No, you would have never seen any of that. There are images coming out showing how a Russian, he's trying to stop the tanks from invading Ukraine, trying to stop it. He's called as brave, he's called as a hero. But when a small Palestinian child grabs a rock and stands in front of Israeli tanks, he's labelled terrorist. And I think this is why Muslims are now seeing that, hey, I think we should now support Russia because we could feel what they've done to us in the last 20 years. We could feel the way they've treated us. We could see the hypocrisy, the way they've treated our asylum seekers in Syria, where they were getting shot in the sea, in the Mediterranean. The Greek ships, Navy personnel were shooting at the boats, the asylum-seeking boats, the refugees. They were drowning. They were trying to drown them in the Mediterranean. But Poland somehow magically opens all its doors and says, we welcome refugees. We welcome Ukrainian refugees. Right? There's no condemnation from Europe saying, oh, all the women should stay there too. All the kids should stay there too. You should all, as men and women, stay to fight for your country. But no, they're saying we welcome the women. We welcome the children into our Europe. So this is a war against Muslims. Look at the link below. We produced a video showing prophecy, that this is a prophecy going to take place where a group of Rum will join the Muslims. I produced that video, and wallahi, some Muslims were saying, no, we don't really see it happening. Russia was killing Muslims. We don't see them joining the Muslims, part of the prophecy to fight against the rest of the West. But if some of these Muslims read history, had a look at some of the companions, Umar ibn Khattab, he was against the Prophet ﷺ. He conspired to kill the Prophet ﷺ. He was hiding behind the Kaaba to kill the Prophet. And verses were revealed. Umar ibn Khattab was so hostile against Islam that he went and even beat up his sister because he found her reading the Quran. And what happened? Allah changed his heart. And he became, after being hostile against Islam and Muslims, he became one of the greatest khilafah for Muslims, a khalif. You look at the story of Khalid ibn Walid, who was at war with Muslims. He took his army to kill the Muslims at Uhud, and he was the main factor for beating the Muslims at Uhud. One of the main factors, other than the archers. Of course, the archers left their position, but it was Khalid. It was Khalid who understood that, and he turned his army, and his army came to destroy the Muslims. And what happened later? Khalid ibn Walid became one of the greatest warriors for Islam. He converted to Islam. So when people say, oh, look, Russians have done this to Muslims and Russians have done that, yeah, sure, but Allah can change their hearts. And we are seeing this unity now being signified. The Chechen Muslims have now joined the Russian ranks. The Chechen brothers, they're our Muslim brothers. There are videos after videos. I can put a hyperlink below this video. You can see for yourself. It's mentioned even on Al Jazeera, where the Muslims are now joining the Russians. And interesting, because some of the Westerners saying, oh, look, it's so typical. It's so typical that the Muslims are joining the Russians. Because they're trying to say, oh, look, they're against the West. Well, wasn't it very typical when you joined the Russians, when they were bombing Syria and the Muslims there? You're with the Russians, weren't you? Did any of you condemn the Russians when they were bombing our brothers and sisters in Syria? That's like me saying, oh, look, it's typical that the Kafirs, the Westerners in Australia, in Great Britain, in America, they support Israel, Kafir supporting Kafir. Isn't that typical? Perhaps now you can taste your own medicine, that since a Christian nation such as Russia joined with Bashar al-Assad, who happens to be from a Muslim sect, you didn't have a problem with that Russian president, Russia joining Assad, killing Muslims, but now you have a problem with Muslims joining Russia, a Christian nation, killing Christians in Ukraine. Now you have a problem. Well, taste your medicine. How does that sound? Yeah, taste your own medicine. It's interesting, karma, Westerners say, oh, we believe in karma. Well, here, this is karma. This is karma for supporting Russia killing Muslims in Syria. This is the karma that you get. Now we find, Jesus Akbar, Jesus Snackbar, Christians killing Christians, Christian crusade versus Christian crusade in Ukraine, over dominance of power, yeah? Earlier they were making fun of Muslims. Oh, look at these Muslims. Look at these barbaric barbarians, Muslims killing Muslims, Look at Syria, all these Muslims. Look at these wars between Sunni and Shia. Look, the world would be such a peaceful place if it wasn't for Islam. And now you have Christians killing Christians, right? But, it's not really Christians killing Christians. Christians are really peaceful people. It's more Putin killing Christians. It's just, it's really one man. Look how they whitewash it. Otherwise Ukrainians are peaceful despite, I'm hearing, this is now in the media, it's saying that Ukrainians are beating up Indian students, not giving them preference to leave the country, giving blue-eye, white people, white Christians the preference to leave the country, and they're beating up these black people, taking them off the train, saying, you don't have a preference to leaving the country. All this discrimination and racism, right? But yeah, Ukrainian are great people. And I want to go back to the point about divide and conquer, the Westerners are saying, for example, if Vladimir Putin, if he resorts to his nuclear arsenal and starts doing all of this nuclear crimes, they call it crimes against humanity, he's going to use nuclear warheads to resort to the Western boycotting aggression, and he's going to use that against his own people because, Ukraine is part of Russia, and if he uses it on Ukraine, Russia's going to be affected by it. So they're trying to cause this disunity, right? Oh, it's going to affect all of humanity, it's going to affect us, our crops are going to be poisoned, our economy is going to be affected. So, the fact that he's going to use this, everyone is going to be against him, everyone's going to be against Putin, and this is an act of terror. If you're going to use it, this is inhumane. This is dictatorship, this is aggression, he's going to be killing thousands of innocent people. But you look at their past and you even look at the modern arguments made by Americans. The only people in the world I know who actually justify the use of a nuclear weapon is Americans. Is Westerners. They are the only people who justify its use when it comes to killing those who they don't like. Then it's completely justified. Its use is completely justified. If Vladimir Putin dropped a nuclear warhead on Syria to kill ISIS, no one would blink an eye. No one would talk about, it's going to poison the sky. It's going to economically disrupt all of us and make our lives miserable and uncomfortable. No, they'd say, we just got rid of the Khilafah. Yes, this is now justified. The ends justified the means, or the means justify the ends, right? And wallahi, they make the same argument when they dropped the bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. We know this. They said, this is what the Americans say even till this day. You ask them, how can you drop a nuclear weapon on 100,000 civilians? It wasn't like you took your nuclear weapon and you specifically targeted a massive platoon of Japanese fighters. No, you specifically dropped 2 bombs targeting a civilian population, targeting Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this is their justification. They say, that if we didn't drop this bomb, more Japanese people and citizens and innocent people would have lost their lives because the war would have continued. The fact we dropped the bomb, it stopped the war, which means the ends justify the means, or the means justify the ends. So here you are, Americans justifying terrorism, targeting men, women, and children, and their argument, well, it stopped the war. Now imagine Muslim terrorists, they said the same exact thing. They said, we're going to blow up a marketplace in New York City, we're going to target men, women, and children, but if the war ends and your aggression stops against us, then that terrorist act is now justified. It's now justified because it stopped a lot more Americans getting killed, stopped a lot more Americans coming to our nations and waging war against us. Now they've stopped. Imagine I used that very same argument. Well, apparently I can. Apparently I can use that same very argument. But then I would be labeled as a terrorist. If I supported suicide bombing, I would be labeled as a terrorist. If I supported killing men, women, and children in a marketplace, I would be labeled as a terrorist. And so I should, because that is an act of terrorism. If I support that, that is. But the Americans don't look at it that way. They justify it. They justify targeting men, women, and children so long as the ends justify the means. It stops the war. Therefore, we can target innocent men, women, and children. And then when they are stuck on this point, when they don't have a comeback, the next line of argument, wallahi, I've heard this from Americans themselves. They have said that no, because, they understand it's a bad argument, right? They understand it's supporting a terrorist act. So the next argument, wallahi, this is the next argument. They say, oh no, the Japanese, the people, they weren't really innocent because, these women, they were supporting their government. They voted their government into power. Therefore, we can justify the killing of these women. Well, what about the children? Do children support the regime? Oh, that's collateral damage. Okay, fair enough. What if ISIS terrorists come to your countries, start bombing your marketplaces, targeting men, women, and children, calling it collateral damage, and justifying it and saying, well, they're not really innocent because those men and those women were voting for a democratically elected government that waged war against us Muslims. Well, it's the same, isn't it? It's the same. So why are you now hesitant? Why are you saying, one's a terrorist and one's not a terrorist? Because both factions have supported your government. Therefore, we can legitimize suicide bombings and targeting men, women, and children because obviously they support their governments for waging war against us. So notice the arguments they make in support of dropping a nuclear warhead on Japan and supporting that act of terror can be used against them easily. Perhaps then, if Russia uses a nuclear warhead on Ukrainians and kills 100,000 people, perhaps they can make the same argument you made on Japan and say, well, if we didn't do the nuclear warhead, then a lot more Ukrainians and a lot more Russians would have been killed in this conflict. And so if it stops the war and Russia becomes victorious overnight, then therefore the ends justify the means. we can even go further with this. Um, we can even go ahead and say, oh, yes, dropping the nuclear warhead on Ukraine also stopped a lot of the asylum seekers, immigrating to Europe. I mean, how could you Europeans cater for all of those Ukrainians, because all of those displaced people, dropping the nuclear warhead on Ukraine would have saved a lot of Ukrainians having to migrate to your lands, having to come, all those displaced Ukrainians, the rest of the surviving ones, they would have had to then come to your lands, but they don't have to come to their lands anymore, to Europe anymore. They don't have to migrate to Europe anymore. They could just stay, and they could live it out, just like the Japanese lived it out. Yes, a lot of them are going to die from radiation and poisoning, but, they're going to come back. I mean, look at Japan. Japan is like a technologically advanced country. Look how they sprung back. So, the Ukrainians under Russian rule, they could come back as well. They could become a superpower. I mean, after all, what are you going to do with all of these Ukrainians? I mean, if this war continues and there's no nuclear weapons, we're probably going to get 6 million, probably 10 million Ukrainians having to come to Europe. And, they're going to have to come to, places like Germany and England and Greece and Poland. And, they're going to take over your infrastructure, and it's going to put pressure on your infrastructure. Your economies can't really deal with this many people coming over to your lands. It's going to put lots of pressure on your economy. How are you going to facilitate for these people when you can't really facilitate for your own? I mean, they're going to come and take your jobs. You can't afford to lose any more jobs. This isn't really going to be good for your economy. I mean, you're really overpopulated. That includes Australia. We're really, populated here in Australia. We have infrastructure issues. I mean, we're going to lose our jobs to all these other migrants coming in and taking our jobs. And, so at least if Vladimir Putin just drops one nuclear warhead on Kiev, they'll just have to rebuild Kiev, maybe after a few years when radioactive material sort of settles. Or, maybe Russia could play it a bit more smart and throw the nuclear warheads possibly further out somewhere, just to give them a warning, maybe in, some of the mountain region somewhere there, just to show them a display of this is what's going to happen if you don't give up Kiev and Ukraine, and if the Westerners don't stop their embargo and against the Russians and their boycotts. Yeah, who knows? I mean, that could actually justify the means. That could stop the war, which could help against the displaced, causing so many Ukrainians to be displaced. So many more Ukrainians losing their lives. Or perhaps you're lying about having no room for Syrian refugees. Perhaps you're lying about Syrians coming and taking your jobs. Perhaps you're lying about, not having money to cater for these people and infrastructure. Perhaps you're lying about all of those and making excuses for Muslim immigration into Europe. But when it comes to Ukrainians, you simply have got the room, the infrastructure, you simply got the economic standard to cater for these people. Perhaps your war was really about Muslims and not really about not having the efficiency to cater for these poor Syrians for humanitarian purposes. Of course. It may be the later, we know, right? So I'll end this video here, and we should continue to support Russia. We should continue to support Russia for the hypocrisy of these Western nations. We should continue to support Russia, and we know that the prophecy will, bi-idhnillah, be fulfilled with the Russians joining the Muslims against the West.